Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is Max Stacy Report coming to you from El Salvador, land of the free, home of the Bitcoin. Yeah, that's right. 5 years ago on Twitter, I predicted that the United Kingdom would need another IMF bailout. Boy, was I right. Stacy.
Right. In fact, we're going to look at a tweet. It was from somebody else who was reporting on what you had said on a podcast, and you predicted, quote, this is a tweet from 2017, and it was Max Keiser, in 5 years, the UK economy will need an IMF bailout. Now, the reason, obviously, they haven't yet applied for a bailout, but the reason why we bring it up 5 years later is because not only is it 5 years later, but Goldman Sachs is predicting UK inflation could top 22% next year. Now, the last time the UK required a bailout from the IMF was in 1976. So we're going to turn to the Wikipedia on that moment, the sterling crisis of 1976. Well, the 1976 sterling crisis was a currency crisis in the United Kingdom in 1976. Inflation at close to 25% in 1975, causing high bond yields and borrowing costs. The balance of payments deficit, the budget overspend, and the 1973 oil crisis were contributors to the problem. So we have another oil crisis. Bond yields obviously aren't anywhere near back then because, of course, central banks at that time were not able to, because we were so recently off gold, were not able to openly do something like quantitative easing. They're doing it now, so maybe that might not happen. But nevertheless, the circumstances look very similar to the history of the last time the IMF came to the rescue of the UK.
Right, and part of the reason they kind of solved some of their problems of isolation and poor management and political class that had grown quite stale and ineffective was by being very active in their trade with the European Union, what became the European Union. So the more that they engaged in trade with the EU, the more robust the United Kingdom economy became. And they were also able to keep the British pound, which was quite a neat trick, which gave them another cute little way to maneuver some GDP growth. But since leaving the EU now, they don't have that buffer anymore. So they're on their own, and the inflation is raging, and there's very little the central bank can do, the Bank of England. And like I said 5 years ago, I would not be surprised, and I will not be surprised when it happens, that the United Kingdom will once again need a bailout. As far as the bond market goes, you have a problem of convexity, where there's just too much debt out there, and the maturity on that debt is extended out toward further reaches of the yield curve, which means that the central bank is less able to manage the financial problems of the United Kingdom and other countries as well. So I think it'll be a lot worse this time than in 1976.
Certainly shortly thereafter, the 1976 sterling crisis, North Sea oil came online. So they did not have that before 1976. They had that after 1976. And of course, oil did help Margaret Thatcher create, an illusion. Well, it was backed by oil. So energy backs everything, right? Energy backs life, production, growth, everything. So they were able to grow out of that situation because of North Sea oil. They blew it all on housing property speculation, as we had mentioned. North Sea oil was also at the same time came online for Norway. Norway saved it all. That's why they're going through perhaps all these crises a little bit better than the United Kingdom and not suffering currency crisis like that. Now, in terms of mismanagement by government, we see in the United States, and you and I reported on this, certainly from Lockdown at Home on our Orange Pill podcast, about those PPP loans, the Payment Protection Act sort of thing, that they, basically millions of dollars were sent to multimillionaires and billionaires for free, right? It was a free write-off. But Max and I were presented with this, like up to $2 million. Free money, we were told from our banker, you don't have to pay it back. And I don't know, it seems like one of those Nigerian prince email scams. I thought there must be a catch, right? We can't they're not going to give us $2 million free dollars. And sure enough, like the document when it arrived to me was the very first words were that by signing this, you are stating and attesting to the fact under law that you require this, that without this money, you would go bankrupt. I was like, well, we wouldn't. So I'm not going to sign it because you know that will forever, therefore, be easily censorable, right? Because the government can say, well, remember 5 years ago you signed that document. You obviously were not going to go bankrupt. Well, that's what I thought. Like, I didn't know, like, now a year, 2 years later, that everybody, like billionaires, Jay-Z accepted some, like, you're like, okay, well, how is that even possible? Well, what I predicted also came true, Max. You predicted the IMF sort of situation. Obviously, the IMF is not in the UK, but certainly the same numbers, the data in terms of inflation and debt in the UK is certainly happening now as was happening back in 1976. But here's some just tweets. I'm just going to read a few of them, but there was a whole line of tweets that the White House tweeted out to any critics of the bailout of student debt. And remember, the student debt, it was targeted to a very, very small percentage of Americans, mostly Democratic voters, who are getting the free money to pay off $20,000 worth of their student debts. So when critics of this started appearing on the news, the White House went through their documents and looked for the critics who had accepted some of those PPP loans. So I'll just read a few of them. The White House says Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene had $183,504 in PPP loans forgiven. Next, Congressman Vern Buchanan had over $2.3 million in PPP loans forgiven because he was complaining. And then sample 3, Congressman Mike Kelly had $983,237 in PP loans forgiven. So, I mean, this seems pretty spooky, right? Like, this is the sort of social credit system that China has, that in the United States, the same White House will point to China and say they're tyrants, they're dictators, they're totalitarian. Well, you're doing the same thing.
Oh, absolutely. The White House and the feds are entrapping these representatives with these fraudulent loans as a way to coerce them and to censor them. So they're no longer ability to represent the constituents who voted for them have been neutered. So there is no representative democracy in the United States. You have the feds that are corrupt and trading on inside information, as we now know, with like Nancy Pelosi and others, who are out there essentially entrapping congressmen and senators with these fake and fraudulent PPP loans, and then using that to silence them when they attempt to stop and voice opposition to programs from the federal government that are enriching the kleptocracy in America. Let's be clear. The America has become a kleptocracy. It's become an oligarchy. So you have oligarchs in the United States, like, for example, when the fall of the Soviet Union happened, there was a rise of oligarchs. Here in America, with the life expectancy down, infant mortality up, paper money printing going berserk, you have a rise of an oligarchy in America, and it's becoming pernicious, ugly, and causing incredible dislocation and anxiety.
Well, again, so the government offered you free money. Take this loan, using the words loan, because it got around basically the Constitution to issue it as a loan. But it's forgivable. We'll just forgive it.
It's a bribe. In other words, they can't print money without congressional oversight. So they lend the money as a loan, which is you don't have to pay it back, not a forgivable loan. So that essentially it is, though, you do the accounting and you do the math, this is a bribe.
They said that you don't have to pay this back. And yet, clearly, Max, what I'm saying is the White House tweeting at 3 individuals that I just highlighted. There were more that they tweeted at Max. They had told them when they signed the document that it was forgivable. Well, what you owed the White House, in fact, was allegiance, was silence, was obedience to what they said. Don't disagree with anything they said. That's what you're paid. That's what the cost was. That's the payback. That's what you were owing the White House. That's
a bribe.
Well, it's certainly not the Republic and the human rights and the free speech and all of the stuff that they say they abide by. No. That is not free speech to be tyrannized like that by the government, I believe. But it's also the way of the shitcoiner, right? This is what shitcoiners are able to do. Like, it costs the White House nothing, right? Because they could just evaporate these fake debts wherever. They evaporated student debts. They issue PPP loans, which put real money into the economy, but it just evaporates like that on the other end, right? So, but it really evaporates into a very inflationary environment. But these shitcoiners can give out this money, dole it out for free, and say, but what they expect is this sort of silence about the flaw of their protocol.
Right. The congressmen and senators in America have become paid influencers by the ultimate shitcoin, the U.S. dollar.
Yes.
So the U.S. dollar is the printing press, just like any of these shitcoins can print billions of tokens, and they give them to the influencers who go on the TV to push their propaganda. And if they balk, they say, oh, you took that money, and now we're going to expose you. And they manipulate the situation accordingly. So the part of the branch, the judiciary, is failed. It's gone. It's fallen. The executive branch has also now fallen because the top executive, the president, is clearly without mental capacities to do that job. So you have the judiciary and the executive are now dead. Over there at the Supreme Court, they recently had a leak where one Supreme Court justice was leaking on another Supreme Court justice. So I would posit that also indicates that that third branch of government is now also dead. So what's left? The fourth branch, as Thomas Jefferson called it, of the press, the free press, that's also been deadened. They're unable to speak freely. Free speech is dead. So where's the life in this republic, Ben Franklin, that you warned us about? Where's the life? Where's the heartbeat? What's actually working? All three branches of government have failed, and the journalistic branches of the press is also dead. What's alive? What's working? Absolutely jack shit's working. That's the answer.
When you brought up the fact of the influencers being bought off with these PPP tokens, essentially, because they were tokens that they could burn and evaporate and make disappear, it reminded me of a situation, and I'm not going to name any particular names because influencers have become highly litigious as well because they're fragile, right? Because it is all smoke and mirrors. So you need the myth and the illusion to sustain, and you can't have anybody speaking the truth because that is the fabric of that shitcoin environment, an ecosystem in which the dollar reigns, but there's 22,000 shitcoins below it. So there was an influencer who was pushing onto his stupid audience a certain token, which then collapsed, and he went to sue the token creator. And then he was forced out of the lawsuit because he had been paid by that company to promote the shitcoin. So that is like what you're saying. This is exactly what happened with these influencers, these Congress people who accepted these PPP loans and then went on to the news and trashed the very token creator who issued them free tokens and then said, hey, we're going to expose you as being an influencer under our command. So that's what we're witnessing here.
It's a clown car.
It's a clown car.
It's three branches of a Ringling Brothers. It's three-ring circus. You've got a three-ring American government system, complete clown car. Well, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, much more coming your way. Oh, hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this, of course, is Plucky. I got a new job. I'm now Plucky's trainer. We're doing some of these sit-ups here. He wants to get as strong as possible for the fiat money apocalypse.
That's right, Max. We're both heading into the fiat money apocalypse, and I'm stacking sats over Swan Bitcoin.
Oh, that's so smart, Plucky. How did you get so smart? Get the Swan app. Welcome back to Max and Stacy Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Lawrence Lepard. He's a money manager and a hard money advocate. Lawrence, welcome back.
Thanks. Good to be with you, Max. Always enjoy talking to you guys.
Lawrence, the dollar is soaring against other fiat currencies, but we can tell from inflation numbers that all fiat currencies are in fact collectively tumbling. The death of the dollar has been predicted for decades, but are we finally in the last days of fiat?
Well, yeah, we're certainly near the end of the fiat game. You know, it's hard to know exactly if it's a few months away or a few years away. That's how these things go, as you know. They're volatile, but yeah, there's a short squeeze on the dollar. It's kind of hilarious, in my opinion. But I guess, you know, given the policies they're pursuing, you would think that might happen right before it dies.
So, Lawrence, on February 26th, we froze 600 billion in Russian reserves. Is this kind of the end game? I mean, does China look at this and say, oh boy, our money can be stolen at any time by the U.S.? Where do you see it going from here?
Yeah, well, it's another brick in the wall, right? I mean, this is an incremental process, as I said earlier, of losing confidence in fiat. And you know, if your fiat can be seized by an aggressive government that's trying to play by their own set of rules, you know, you're going to stop using it. And this is why we see China and Russia and Turkey and a number of other countries, you know, doing deals directly in their own currency, and the percentage of world transactions denominated in the dollar is falling rapidly. And as the world's reserve currency, that's a bad thing for the dollar and really for all paper currencies eventually, because fiat is fiat, and it's not just the dollar. The dollar just happens to be the most notable and largest one. So yeah, that's a brick in the wall. You know, I'm sure when that occurred, China, Russia, well, obviously Russia, but you know, China, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, India, all these other countries took note. I mean, I've seen India is doing transactions with Russia denominated in Chinese yuan. I mean, what's that all about, right? So yes, we are watching fiat currency die as we speak.
Deglobalization seems to be intensifying, and de-dollarization as well. Where do we go from here?
Well, this is, I'm sure you guys have read it. I bet a lot of your listeners have too. If not, they can Google it and find it. Zoltan Posner really made a great recent paper where he talked about how, you know, these wars have basically broken the globalization system, and now, you know, trust has been lost. And so when trust is lost, people don't want to trade with one another, and supply chains become iffy, and getting, you know, inventory is almost liquidity. And so people have to overbuy in order to make sure they have enough. And that's part of what we see going on right now. You know, that's part of the larger problem associated with fiat currency failing. So yeah, you know, the wars, I mean, as Posner points out, I mean, you know, we were shipping China cheap dollars and they were shipping us manufactured goods, and Russia was shipping the world cheap commodities and we were shipping them paper. And both, well, started by Russia, but it's being followed somewhat by China. Both are saying, we don't want this paper anymore. These paper dollars aren't any good. So give us an alternative. And, you know, that's what's occurring. It's very clear to me, Max, I'm sure it is to you as well, that we are in the end game of fiat. And, you know, fiat will die. We just don't know exactly when. We have to be patient.
So, Lawrence, hundreds of billions of dollars of student debts were just written off. But of course, it was just transferred to the taxpayer. I mean, this is essentially moral hazard gone berserk, right? Because why would anyone assume that they would ever have to pay their debts off ever again?
That's right. I mean, it's look, this started in 2008, right? When we created socialism for the rich by bailing out the banks. That was free money for the wrong people. And then we followed it through with the PPP programs and COVID. And I know a lot of businesses that got huge PPP loans. They didn't need them. They were forgiven. So that was socialism for businesses. And, it's not surprising to me, probably shouldn't be to anyone else either, that students are saying, hey, you're handing out free money. Where's mine? And it starts with the 10,000. It's probably going to grow to a much larger number. I mean, this is a trend, right? And, we see in England and the continent that the energy rates are blowing up, and all these people are being forced to pay much higher electrical rates, or they're going to go bankrupt. Well, that there are going to be subsidies to help address that. And so, really, the bottom line, as you guys have pointed out so many times on your brilliant show, is that the printer's going burr and it can't stop, and that's why fiat is doomed.
Speaking of energy, when I look at these energy charts, they don't look like they're just rising due to inflation, and they look absolutely nonsensical. They've gapped open to unheard of historical prices. I mean, it looks crazy, Lawrence. What's going on?
Yeah, no, those curves are Weimar-like, right? I mean, base load electricity, Germany and France, it's up 10x. I mean, things are terribly, terribly broken. And those of us who are watching all the little signs can see it. The average normies don't see it, or don't see it as clearly. They know that their gasoline cost is higher. They know something's not right, but I don't think they fully understand the depth of the problem and how it's just going to continually get worse. And one of the things I find most amazing is the view that a lot of people have. If you look at the swaps, if you look at the 5x5 inflation swap, which is what sophisticated players think the inflation rate is going to be 5 years out for the next 5 years, it's still at 2.6%. And so, I mean, this is shocking to me. There are actually large pools of money in the world that think we're going back to a 2.6% inflation rate. That ship has sailed. That is not going to happen. We had peak deflation in March of 2020. I mean, on an intraday basis, the 10-year traded at 43 basis points. It closed at 69. The point is that we are now in an inflationary world driven by a combination of the response to COVID and the war in the Ukraine and the implications of seizing the Russian reserves and what China and Russia are doing. And so the world has changed, and yet the entire investment world is still looking in the rearview mirror thinking we're going to go back to that. And they're dumping gold, dumping Bitcoin, dumping sound assets, not realizing that those are the only things that are going to save them when this inflationary holocaust comes. And it's coming. I mean, we're going to have extremely high inflation. We're going to have $150 oil, $200 oil. It's going to be a nightmare. But, right now, because Powell is trying to be, Paul Volcker, which is a joke. I mean, he's a fraction of that guy, but he's trying it because he doesn't have any other choice. And what he's going to do is he's going to crater the market, and then he's going to have to come back, and they're going to have to print 10x what they would have printed otherwise. The next Fed print, the last Fed print was billions of dollars, and this next one is going to be multiples of that, in my opinion.
Let's look at, you mentioned quantitative easing there. And the big picture is that you've got central banks that have been quantitatively easing for an extended period of time. As you point out, now they're tightening, quantitative tightening. It's kind of a sudden shock to the system. But in fact, we're at a point where it's going to become clear, Lawrence, I'm curious what you think about this, that there is no real way to get inflation rate, as you're talking about there, back to 2.6%, as is indicated by the 5-year swap market, without quantitative easing kicking in a big way and crashing the economy. That's the only way you can get inflation down. But I have a feeling what you're suggesting is that that's really not going to happen. There's no political will for it. And we're going to have a return to a massive money printing. Lawrence, what do you think?
Yes, that's correct. You summarized it perfectly. And I think it's actually starting to happen now. I mean, days like today where the stock market's down 2% and the 10-year yield is up 4% are like the worst nightmare for the Fed. I mean, they do not want this. If the bond market should be on a down stock market day, the bond market should be catching an enormous bid, and it's not. And that tells you all you need to know. And that's because people know inflation is the problem, so they're not running to the bond. They're not in the stocks because they know the stocks are overvalued and earnings are going to go down. And yes, so they're going to drive us into a depression. And the thing, Max, that I think a lot of people don't fully understand, and Powell even didn't understand it until recently, and then Luke Gromen had some good stuff about what happened at Jackson Hole in a paper that came out there. But when you increase these interest rates, I mean, part of the reason we have inflation is we don't have enough supply of things. And so in order to create more supply, you've got to spend money on CapEx. And if you want to spend money on CapEx, you're weighing it as against the, the rate of interest that you're paying. Well, if you increase interest rates, that makes it more expensive to spend money on CapEx. So in a backward sense, they're increasing interest rates to fight inflation is not going to really solve a big part of the underlying cause of inflation, which is lack of investment or malinvestment in the wrong things. I mean, for the last 10 years, we have not invested enough in commodities, and we've had these stupid ESG policies, and that's why, the electrical situation in the European continent and England is just so bad, because they've gone in the wrong direction. So we've got to address and solve those problems, and higher interest rates aren't going to help. I mean, higher interest rates are going to definitely slow the economy, and he's going to create some unemployment. I mean, the whole thing is just maddening and sickening. I mean, I compare it to what they're trying to do. It's like economic whiplash. I mean, they gave away a ton of free money, created this enormous inflation, and they realized they'd made the biggest policy mistake in the history of the Fed. They turned around, they slammed on the brakes, and now we're going to go skidding towards the other side. I mean, I've in my other podcasts, I've said this is like these guys are driving a clown car and they're bouncing it off these two guardrails. One is massive inflation, the other is massive deflation. The only realistic way they have out of it is to try and steer somewhere in the middle and create a lot of inflation for a long time, which will, by the way, benefit Bitcoin and what I also invest in, gold, which I know you guys don't like as much. But the point is, and they're not even able to do that because all the dials are going nuts. It's like they're in a plane that's inverted. Once you invert your plane, you lose the pneumatic pressure, and you can't trust your AI indicator anymore. You can't trust, the altimeter starts to unwind. You don't know what the fuck you're doing. And that's kind of where they're at right now. They don't know what the fuck they're doing. It's really a mess. As you can tell, I'm kind of pissed off about it.
Oh, right. I think I read that exact phrase. That's a rarely used economic phrase in Jerome Powell's testimony. Look, I call it the Bermuda Triangle economy, where you're flying through the economy and all of your instruments are spinning in opposite directions. And of course, it's a recipe for a total failure and crash. Lawrence Lepard, thanks for being on Max and Stacy Report. Always great to have you on.
Thanks, guys. It was fun to be with you. Thank you.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Max and Stacy Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert, coming to you from El Salvador, land of the free, home of the Bitcoin. Until next time, bye, y'all.